This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a one-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
It is Monday, December the 2nd, 2024. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen, Slate Sports Podcast. Back with you again. I'm Alex Kirshner. I'm a contributing writer for Slate, and I'm the co-host of the National College Football podcast Split Zone Duo. This week, I've got my typical great panel with me. We will talk about yet another doping story involving one of the best tennis players in the world, the chaotic race to the first ever 12-team college football playoff, and a critical question in the NFL. Is the classic featured running back as the focal point of the offense back? Or is that just a mirage provided by Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley? At least for a few elite teams, it does look like the running back is back to its old point of focus in an NFL offense. As usual, joining me this week is Lindsay Gibbs. She is the author and the founder of Power Plays, a bi-weekly newsletter that adds key context to the biggest stories of the day in women's sports. Lindsay was formerly the co-host of the feminist sports podcast Burn It All Down. She has written for Business Insider, The Athletic, The Ringer, Bleacher Report, and USA Today, among many more media outlets. Now she joins us here frequently on Hang Up and Listen. Lindsay, how are you?
I cannot believe it is December. Just having a hard time wrapping my mind around time passing.
It's like that classic Green Day tune, Wake Me Up When December Ends. Yeah. People have been singing it for decades.
You nailed that. Nailed it.
Also back this week is Ben Lindbergh. He is a senior editor for The Ringer. He is the co-host of the Effectively Wild Baseball podcast. He is the co-author of The MVP Machine, How Baseball's New Nonconformists Are Using Data to Build Better Players, and the Only Rule Is It Has to Work, Our Wild Experiment Building a New Kind of Baseball Team. You might know him from his frequent times here on Hang Up. You might know him from his work at 538 or Grantland, or as the editor-in-chief of Baseball Prospectus. Ben, great to see you.
In honor of the LA Dodgers, I'll be deferring today's greeting until 2034. But I look forward to talking to you both in the meantime.
By that point, the greeting might barely be worth anything in today's dollars.
Exactly.
So I don't know, that's very difficult for us, but I look forward to it then.
Everything will be crypto by then, I think. So.
Yes. What's the net present value of my greeting today?
Before we get into our business, as always, we want to thank our Slate Plus members for making this show possible. One method of saying thanks is with a bonus show. And this week, we will talk about where sports fans are migrating on the internet and if enough of them are doing it to change the way the cultural mainstream consumes live sports altogether or not. Yeah, we will talk about Bluesky. You can hear that episode right now, as long as you're a Slate Plus member. Subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking try free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. Back in the fall, then women's world number one tennis player Iga Swiatek of Poland took some time off. Swiatek announced in mid-September that she would not play in the China Open in Beijing, one of the year's biggest tournaments outside of the Grand Slams. It was a little odd, some people noticed, but not an earth-shattering thing at the time. She had played a lot of tennis, not just the usual schedule, but also taking a disappointing bronze medal in the Olympics. Swiatek said that she was backing out, quote, due to personal matters. We know now what those matters were. Swiatek was serving a provisional suspension for what the International Tennis Integrity Agency ultimately ruled was the unintentional taking of a banned substance known as TMZ. It came, Swiatek said, from a contaminated dose of melatonin. The ITIA ultimately did levy a 1-month suspension with time served, counted towards that from when she had been sitting out earlier. If this story sounds familiar, it is because Swiatek is not the only world number one tennis player to test positive for a performance enhancer this year. Italian Janik Sinner in the men's game tested positive twice for a PED in March, but the Tennis Integrity Agency did not suspend him, accepting his explanation that his physiotherapist had accidentally contaminated him through a cut with an over-the-counter spray. But Sinner's story isn't done yet, as the World Anti-Doping Agency is seeking a 1 to 2 year suspension in an appeal of the tennis authorities' lack of one. Lindsay Gibbs, that's 2 number ones, a whole handful of positive tests, and no proof that anyone cheated on purpose, but a pretty huge cloud over tennis right now. How dark is that cloud?
It is extremely dark. I just really can't fathom like, this is unbelievable to have 2 number ones in doping controversies, one on each tour at a time where the tours are kind of in transition from old stars to new stars. It's really awful. And look, I think each individual case, and we can get into the details in the weeds later in this segment if we want, there's certainly reason to believe that the players were not at fault. But I think it puts the whole system in question. The fact that these provisional suspensions can be handed down and players can give excuses, such as personal reasons or coaching changes, but they're actually serving a provisional doping sentence, that's just ridiculous. I mean, I understand it. Like, understand why we're doing it. It's to protect the player until all the facts come out and all the adjudication can be done behind closed doors. But as a fan, you're going to get to the point where every time a player withdraws from a tournament, you're going to wonder, is this really a cover for a provisional doping suspension? I also think that there's a lot of questions around all of these supplements and contamination, and the amount that was found in Swiatek's sample was so minuscule that, they ultimately confirmed that it wouldn't have been performance enhancing at all. And it wasn't really, the pattern wasn't like it was in the middle of a cycle because she tested negative around that test. And so I think that, there's questions of, are we setting the threshold too low here? Should the threshold be higher a bit if every single one of these cases that comes forward is just like an unintentional contamination, trace evidence? It's a lot of drama, a lot of money spent for stuff that's not really making the sport any safer and is in fact just eroding trust all around. There's also the fact that players such as Iga Swiatek and Janik Sinner both have more resources to be able to fight back against these doping bans than lower ranked players. Iga was able to find that it was the melatonin sample that had the TMZ in it because she had a huge team, because she has so much money, and she could get all of that testing done very, very quickly. Lower ranked players don't have that, and there's no fund set aside for, their defense. And, in tennis, how it works is you're given a provisional sentence immediately upon when the test is revealed to you, but you have 10 days to appeal that. And so if you can get your appeal done in 10 days, then it can stay under wraps and under secrecy. But that's a short amount of time. Lower ranked players don't have those resources. And a lot of them feel like that Iga Swiatek and Janik Sinner are getting preferential treatment. Like, again, I think it's just more a resources thing. And ultimately, there's the fact that, are we naive for believing all these quote unquote innocent explanations, which is a problem I have as someone who, wants to believe the best in players, doesn't want to believe that everyone is doping. Am I living here in La La Land where I am going to be made a fool of for believing these explanations that were being given? It's a mess. The cloud is, it's a disaster cloud.
The first point you brought up, Lindsay, about the severity of the actual offenses at the root of the suspensions here is why, while I agree that there's a cloud, maybe I differ slightly on how dark the cloud is. Just because, yes, it's not good for the sport that 2 then number 1 players, both 23 years old, 7 slams between them, to have them both embroiled in doping scandals, not good, because a lot of people won't read beyond the headlines and will question the achievements not just of these 2 players, but potentially the integrity of tennis at large. However, and stop me if I'm being a PED apologist or PED Pollyanna or some other alliterative term here, but it seems to me that there are 2 potential causes for concern. There's the concern about whether tennis has a doping problem, and then there's the concern about whether tennis has a problem with elite players receiving preferential treatment. And I think those are separate concerns, even though they seem connected and are intertwined in this case, because even though these are scandals, I kind of question whether the doping dimensions of these situations should be scandalous. Swiatek was deemed to have no significant fault or negligence, and I'm not sure I see a significant problem when it comes to the actual doping in tennis. Here we have a player who not only was established not to have intentionally taken a performance-enhancing drug, but also seemingly didn't derive a performance-enhancing effect because her test contained this trace amount, 1/1,000,000th of a gram, less than a single dose if you were taking it for therapeutic reasons. And I understand the point of taking a hardline stance when it comes to PEDs, and I understand why "oops, I didn't mean to" isn't a sufficient explanation, even if it's true. But if you didn't mean to take it and taking it didn't benefit you, I don't really see what we're punishing exactly, because why do sports test for PEDs in the first place? A, to prevent players from trying to cheat, and B, to prevent them from deriving an unfair advantage, and by extension, to promote confidence that those things aren't happening in a widespread way. There's no evidence that these two derived advantages. And again, that's where I, like you, think, am I being naive, right? I understand that there may be designer substances in use that are undetectable by tests entirely, because the science of cheating is often one step ahead of the science of stopping cheating. But in Swiatek's case, you have one positive test of a trace amount in her urine, a negative test of her hair, confirmation that the positive could have been caused by this melatonin she took. Sinner's situation is similar, if a little harder to swallow, so to speak, because he had two positive tests and his substance was a steroid, and his explanation is a little farther fetched, or at least sounds that way, that the substance was transmitted through his skin during massage by a trainer who used a spray on a cut on his hand. It's just a little more elaborate, but there doesn't seem to be any sign that positive tests and suspensions have increased lately across the board. So it's these isolated high-profile cases driving coverage, and that coverage is not good, and there's a reason why it's not good. But it does seem to me that maybe the larger issue, albeit the one that probably on the whole fewer people care about, is whether it's easier for someone like Swiatek, because of her resume and her resources, to establish her innocence. And that, I think, is a legitimate concern. Even though the rules do apply to everyone on paper, it's the same rules. It's just that some people have a greater capacity to navigate that system. Of course, the problem of rich and famous people having advantages that others don't is hardly exclusive to tennis.
Brand new.
Yes.
Lindsay, on the Sinner side, this has been going on for a few months now. The World Anti-Doping Agency trying to take another bite at the apple and see to an extended suspension for him. How has that changed the air around men's competitive tennis in the past few months, given that, as we talked about last week, there have sort of been bigger fish to fry? You know, we've been sending off Rafa Nadal. We've been transitioning into this new era, of which Sinner is kind of at the tip of the spear. His situation seems to be more of a going problem, more of an ongoing story than Iga Swiatek's. And I'm curious to what extent that specifically, the ongoing nature of it, has been an issue for men's tennis.
Yeah, I think that men's tennis is lucky in part that not many, and maybe tennis in general, that not as many people pay attention to the post-US Open swing of things, are kind of hoping that this gets swept under the rug. But the Australian Open is coming up in about 5 weeks, and Janik Sinner will be the defending champion. And as you mentioned, Alex, WADA is appealing the ruling. So in Sinner's case, there was a finding of zero fault from him. Apparently, decided he should not have to know everything about what his trainer was rubbing into him and the supplement. This was something he was not himself taking. It was being used by his trainer. So they found no fault. So ultimately, while there was a brief provisional suspension, And while he did lose ranking points and money from the tournament in which the positive sample was found, which I believe was Indian Wells, he ultimately didn't serve any official suspension and was found no fault. And that no fault ruling is what WADA is appealing. They think that he should be found to have been at least minorly negligent, which is what Swiatek was found to be. So they said, even though we agree that this was not doping in the traditional sense, players still have a responsibility to only take supplements to figure out what's in their supplements before they take them. It is, there's some danger. So she ended up getting just a 1-month suspension, of which, because the provisional suspension, she's already served 22 days of, and the other 8 days come now when there's no tennis being played. So essentially it's over for her. So that's a very small sentence. But I think that's an important difference, because I didn't really understand that until looking into it. So it's unlikely that WADA would appeal Swiatek's sentence, because she was found to have fault. There was a suspension put in place. But WADA is saying, with the Sinner thing, how can you say he has no responsibility? And the answer, to now get back to your question, Alex, is that it's going to be a really big cloud over men's tennis going forward, because Sinner is going to have to keep dealing with this and keep answering these questions. And at the U.S. Open, I have to give him credit. He did a really good job handling it and obviously compartmentalizing. News broke of this all happening right before the U.S. Open began. He went on to win the trophy. So, and if it's been distracting him as the year's gone on, he certainly didn't show it, winning the ATP finals and the Davis Cup, having one of the best end of the years you could possibly have. But, people don't want to be played a fool. And I think there's a lot of people who look at all of these cases and say, is it really true that in each one of these, there's an innocent explanation? Does that mean that nobody is doping? I just think that the plethora of them and the ongoing nature of them and the seeming unfairness of them, even if it's not unfairness in ruling, but again, like we discussed, unfairness in resources, it's going to be hard for Sinner to shake that. And he could get up to, I believe, a 1 or 2 year ban. That's very unlikely, but that's still hanging over his head. So it's ugly for men's tennis, for tennis in general. Even though I agree, we are not baseball in the 90s yet. We are not at, crisis 101, but there's a lot of smoke.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that your name is sullied, your reputation is stained rightly or wrongly when this has been attached to you, is why players don't come forward. They want to wait until something that will provide some exculpatory evidence, if they think there's going to be some, or to be cleared even. And so even if Sinner is at the tip of the spear, as you said, Alex, he's not at the tip of a syringe, at least legally speaking. He's just at the tip of a finger that was coated in some sort of spray on steroids that was applied to his skin during a massage, if you believe that chain of custody, that evidence, that explanation. And it is, I think, appropriate that the ITAA takes into account some mitigating circumstances or circumstances particular to the player, and even holds some stars to a higher standard, at least if you believe the letter of the law, because it's supposed to take into account your experience, your age, your resources. If you have a staff, if you've made more than $30 million lifetime like Swiatek has, if you, in theory at least, have the resources to test everything that you put in your body before you do, so that you can see if it'll show up on a test. Whereas if you're a lower seeded player who doesn't have those sorts of resources, you're kind of at the mercy of any contaminated substance you might ingest there. But it does make me wonder. I mean, it doesn't seem as if anyone's credibly suggesting that, say, Swiatek is actually guilty and that the authorities covered up her guilt because she was world number one and has won 5 slams, and it would be an even blacker eye or cloud, if we want to stick with the meteorological language here, if she were more guilty. It just seems like people are upset about how her case was handled. And Simona Halep, for one, who was suspended for a longer term, she came out and issued a statement or put out an Instagram post and complained. And, sometimes I think the players who say that there are double standards, they exaggerate their case a little bit. Like Halep said it was an identical case, and it wasn't exactly identical. It was a different substance. It was a different amount. There was a second accusation about an issue with her biological passport. She didn't have an immediate explanation for her violation the way that Swiatek did. So I think there's some unavoidable resentment of more successful players, period, just because they're more successful, and that leads to some bitterness and envy. And then there are also advantages that they do get that have nothing to do with doping, favorable schedules and conditions when it comes to courts and draws and all of that. And that bitterness builds up to the point that when you have a prominent player who doesn't get a suspension or gets off with a slap on the wrist, seemingly, then people say, oh, it's the double standard, it's tennis favoring its stars, which it does in some respects. I don't know if it does in this respect or if it's just that, they have more of an ability to prove their innocence or at least demonstrate it. And I don't know what you do. Do you reform the system so that you have a higher threshold for a positive test? Why are we flagging trace amounts? Is it that, well, maybe there's a masking agent, or is it, maybe we're not testing regularly enough and so you detect a trace amount? Maybe it means there was a higher amount previously. So it sounds sort of, to say, let it slide. It's just a little bit of steroids, not enough to actually do anything. Maybe that sounds like a slippery slope. That's, too lax potentially, but maybe not. Maybe we're flagging too many positives as a problem, or maybe you provide some sort of public defender or something for a player who is not able to mount an appeal and marshal the resources that a Swiatek or a Sinner can. Though then again, you're right back in our regular legal system and people being able to pay for a better lawyer than most public defenders are going to give you.
And it's important to note the Halep case is interesting because she was not a lower ranked player. She was a former number one, 2-time Grand Slam champion. Simona Halep has all the resources in the world, very close relationship with Adidas. Money was not the problem for Halep. So that's, a case that maybe there wasn't preferential treatment given, although we do not have time to go into the weeds on Halep's case, but her essential provisional ban was a much longer than what ended up being the final ban that she got. And that's also very unfair, it seems. So, and it's ruined the last 2 years of her career. But like you said, there's a lot more smoke there than there is in the Swiatek case, though I understand her being upset. But
yeah. And there are some lower-seeded players, some less prominent players most people probably haven't heard of, who have essentially gotten the treatment that Sinner and Swiatek did, right? Not everyone has the book thrown at them. You just may not be as aware of those cases because they're not big news outside the tennis world. The other possible reform that people have alluded to is that maybe this should be more transparent, that it should just be announced from the start that someone isn't playing not for personal reasons or a personal matter, but because they are currently appealing or there was a positive test. And people are faulting Swiatek to some extent for not coming clean about what was causing her to sit out those 3 tournaments, which led in part to her ranking falling from number 1. And again, I don't know that I fault her for that personally, because this is the way the system is set up. If you want to change that and mandate that this comes out immediately, some sports do have systems more along those lines, and you could do that. But the actual authorities here are bound by confidentiality. So I don't know that we need to put the onus on the players to come out and throw themselves at the mercy of the court of public opinion before the appeal is concluded, before all the information is out there. Because as soon as this surfaces, again, there's going to be that stain attached to their name. And if the surface is before they've been cleared or quasi-cleared, then it would be even worse. So I don't know that I have a problem really with essentially some sort of due process here or keeping it quiet until things are settled. That's the way it works in baseball, for instance. In MLB, you don't often get a positive test overturned, but if that were to happen, if a player were to appeal their positive test and not get suspended at all, then in theory, that's never supposed to come out. That's never even supposed to surface and become public knowledge. So I guess you could say, well, Swiatek got a very light sentence here and it's still out there. Maybe it would have been better for her if she'd gotten ahead of it, if it was going to come out anyway. But there's at least maybe some possibility that it never comes out because there's no wrongdoing. So as the current system stands, I don't personally fault a player for saying personal matters.
Yeah, in that case, though, should there be provisional sentences at all, or should they just be able to keep playing while adjudicating this in the background? Because I think the point is fans and media don't like being lied to, and so it's tough. I get all sides. I also want to point out another thing that comes into factor. Weeks at number one is a really big stat when we're comparing tennis legacies, and both Sinner's and Swiatek's, they both lost points from their tournaments where the positive sample was found, and that ended up impacting retroactively what week the other players would have been number one. So what week Djokovic lost his number one ranking. And then on the WTA side, what week Sabalenka was able to earn the number one ranking over Swiatek. And the ATP did not go back and retroactively change that. The history books stayed exactly the same. And my friend Ben Rothenberg in his newsletter, Substack newsletter Bounces, brought up the fact that the WTA has a chance to do something different. This, again, is just kind of something for the nerds. But I do think it's interesting, how if the points were taken away in real time, what that would have done to the rankings eventually versus the retroactive losing of points.
Speaking of a bit of controversy over rankings and where people should be slotted in a national or a international ranking of sporting entities, the college football playoff race is chaos. The 12-team playoff coming up for the first time ever in a couple of weeks. What are we learning as it comes to a head? We'll talk about it. This holiday season, don't forget your number one fan, you. So what's a gift you could use? Maybe go to more home games, or even travel to some away games while rocking a new away team jersey. Well, here's something for you. Discover automatically doubles all the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. With Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. That'll help with the swanky away jersey. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. There are more than 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States and millions more around the world. How do you know which ones can make the biggest impact with your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They pore over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-backed organizations that are saving and improving lives. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Hang Up and Listen at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Hang Up and Listen to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. Alex Kirshner back here on Hang Up and Listen with Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs. The college football playoff field will be set less than a week from now, and the whole race has become a real doozy. It is the first year of a new 12-team system after a decade of the event having just 4 teams, and before that having just 2 when the system at play was the Bowl Championship Series. And before that, having none at all. It's been a gradual march from no playoff to 2 to 4 to 12 for college football. When the event expanded this last time, much of the idea was just about television dollars for the Big Ten and the SEC, the two richest conferences. We can all be real and clear about that. But part of the idea was also competitive, specifically that expanding access to the playoff would imbue more games with meaning and allow more championship-capable teams the opportunity to prove it on the field. One of those things has happened. The TV dollars from ESPN are indeed great for conferences and teams. There are more big games late in the season than ever before as well. But the other thing, the thing about great teams getting a shot to prove it on the field in the playoff, is looking a little questionable as we get into this first 12-team playoff, because what's actually happened is that a bunch of teams have demonstrated that they are not seaworthy, that the sport would be just fine if they were not included in the playoff because they are faltering again and again in the regular season. But the system's got to get 12 teams, and so there's going to have to be room. There is no way around it for someone like a 10-2 Miami, which just lost at Syracuse at the formerly named Carrier Dome, or perhaps for a 9-3, that's a 3-loss team from the SEC, whether that be Alabama or South Carolina or Ole Miss. But most importantly, the Ohio State Buckeyes are still going to make it after they lost to Michigan. Ben, did you have a good chuckle at Ohio State losing to this dilapidated shell of Michigan on Saturday?
I am currently having one. It was another sad day for Ryan Day, maybe the saddest yet, because this time the Buckeyes were favored by 21 points, which was evidently the widest point spread for an Ohio-Michigan game since 1978. One amusing thing was Ohio getting called for a 12 players on the field penalty the month after Day was seen screaming on the sidelines about Oregon having 12 players on the field in a game in mid-October, which turned out to be an intentional exploitation of a loophole that has since been closed. The other amusing thing was when the Wolverines attempted to plant their flag at midfield, which led to a melee, $100,000 fines for each team, and some players being pepper sprayed by police. The pepper spray was not amusing, but I did enjoy Day defending his players' capture the flag antics by saying, there are some prideful guys on our team who weren't going to sit back and let that happen, even though that is exactly what they did during the game.
Precisely what they did.
Yes.
I mean, could not be more of what they did.
But as you noted, Alex, that was just one of the wild games during rivalry week. And as a Georgetown grad who married into a Syracuse family, I witnessed one firsthand when Syracuse beat Miami. There was much rejoicing among my in-laws, who are not my rivals, when Syracuse came back from being down 21-0. And even the non-upsets defied belief. Georgia Tech took Georgia to 8 overtimes. And after the Bulldogs' 44-42 win, Georgia linebacker Jalen Walker said, "I ain't watching no football game that long," which is basically the "I ain't reading that, I'm happy for you though," or "sorry that it happened" meme in real life. Anyway, we did a segment on the topsy-turvy college football landscape in October, which I believe came right after a Michigan loss to Washington. And I understand that the results themselves have been largely unpredictable, but the most predictable effect of expanding the playoffs is lowering the bar for entry to the playoffs, right? So how surprising is that some teams will sneak in who otherwise wouldn't have cleared that bar in previous seasons?
It's a good question. Maybe naive of me to express a little surprise that there will be a 9-3 SEC team, quite possibly in the field. I've talked about that possibility throughout the year. And, you know, I think what is disappointing about it is that right now, pending the playoff selection committee's next batch of rankings that will take us into the weekend, those come out Tuesday night, it looks like that might be Alabama. And I think there is something particularly demoralizing about Alabama being the 9-3 team that gets in, given that Alabama, in the minds of many college football fans, and not without justification, given last year when it leapfrogged an unbeaten Florida State after Alabama lost the SEC championship, is this notion that Alabama is the apple of the committee's eye and they're always looking to do favoritism towards the Crimson Tide. You know, I think that if it were to be the 9-3 South Carolina Gamecocks, who have been very hot late in the season and are not one of the sport's blue bloods, or heck, even the 9-3 Ole Miss team that beat up on that South Carolina team earlier in the year, it might feel a little bit less, what are we doing here? There is also the possibility of that 10-2 Miami team that we talked about. So I think that in this first year of the event, there's just not an overflow of teams that feel playoff worthy, that feel playoff ready, even if you accept there was probably always going to be a 9-3 SEC or Big Ten team. And the notion of it being Alabama just makes it seem like more of a bummer, less exciting.
I get that. I get what you're saying. But once again, to be the casual voice here, this is fun. I love that we went into rivalry week and now, the championship games, the conference championship games, with more on the line than just the games themselves. Like, it's harder for me. Like, rivalry games, I get that the point is that they always matter. But the truth is, late in the season, unless you're a diehard college football fan or a diehard fan of those teams, it's more than likely than not that they don't matter, right? Beyond just the game themselves. This time, though, there were a lot of different implications for those games. And I love just the amount of questions that remain about who's going to get these buys and what these conference championship games, which are meaningful among themselves, just the winner and loser matters, of course, but also have all these side implications. Call me a masochist, but that stuff is fun to me. The kind of, what do we do with SMU of all of it? I enjoy that. Gives us a little bit more to talk about, and I personally love that. I really tried to internalize the rules for making the 12 teams, and Alex, I might need you to explain it to me like I am a third grader or whatever that first grader, whatever that meme is. Higher ranking conference champions and first round buys and other, what the rankings mean. But I don't know. This is fun.
It is fun. I think that the general puzzle pieces that have to be fit together is that you get 12 teams. That includes the 5 highest ranked conference champions.
And it's highest ranked not by the AP, but by the committee's rankings, right?
By the playoff committee. So the 5 highest ranked conference champions make it. Of course, there are now only 4 so-called power conferences, and really, you could argue only 2 power conferences, with the Big Ten and the SEC, and then you have the ACC and the Big 12 after that. But this does mean that there is automatically going to be a slot for what you would call the group of 5 conferences, or what casuals might call the mid-major conferences. That is going to be the Mountain West Conference this year. The winner of its championship game, Boise State and UNLV, is going to be in the playoff. And the really interesting piece, and where you're getting a bit of class warfare in college football that I'm very excited to see how it settles, is that there had been people who have thought that every year forever, the non-power conference champion that gets in would be relegated to the 12th seed, because the committee has tended to be very disrespectful towards teams outside the power conferences over its first 10 years in the 14 playoff. It is currently looking like if Boise State were to win the Mountain West with the best running back in the country, Ashton Genty, who is over 2,000 yards, like Boise State might get the number 4 seed and a critical bye in the first round, and require the Big 12 champion, which is going to be either Arizona State or Iowa State, to play as the 11 or 12 seed in the first round on the road in a very difficult environment, be that at Penn State or at Notre Dame. And boy, would that be a lot of fun. What an ego bruise that would be to the conscience, the heart of the Big 12. The Big 12's commissioner is this guy, Brett Yormark, who's sort of a showman and has been very publicly pounding the table about how it would be wrong for the Big 12 to not get a bye. It wouldn't be quite as satisfying as, for instance, an SEC champion, Georgia, not getting a bye, but it would be fairly satisfying. It would be a fun story, and something that a lot of people have doubted would ever happen.
Yeah.
I love it.
Well, incumbents are losing left and right all around the world, so maybe this is of a piece with that. We just want to thumb our noses at the powerhouses and see some comeuppance. And I think Lindsay's enthusiasm is widely shared because the TV ratings are going gangbusters. It is, by some metrics, the most watched college football season since 2016. I think because more teams, and by extension more fans, have skin in the game, or pigskin in the game, as the case may be. And so I wonder what the future is, what this spells for further expansion, potentially, because it's hard to put this genie back in the bottle. Playoffs expand. They very rarely contract unless you're coming off a pandemic season or something. And I think it's dangerous to draw conclusions about a playoff format one way or another based on a single season's standings or results, because people who didn't like that system will use that as evidence to say, see what you got, and people who do like it will say, well, this worked out wonderfully. And the next year, of course, it could be completely different, and it might be chalkier, and there might be fewer upsets and less intrigue. But I do wonder, since this has been, on the whole, a rating success, and people, at least people who follow programs that might not have been in the thing otherwise, are into it, are we heading for 14-team playoffs, 16-team playoffs, where maybe every conference champion gets to make it? Maybe it's a little less inscrutable to the casuals like Lindsay and me how you get in and who gets in. And I also wonder whether conference championship games are still as meaningful. Are their days numbered? I think for now, they do well enough. They're going to draw better than a regular game. But what if you expand the playoffs and you just end up with an additional round of playoffs instead of conference championships? Especially if you're in a situation where playing in one of them could be disadvantageous to a team. It might be better to miss the conference championship, get a bye week, as long as you're still qualified for the playoffs and you can rest up. So bring out your crystal ball, Alex. Where are we headed?
Well, I do think it's a matter of time until there is playoff expansion. This is still one of the smallest football playoffs in the world at 12 teams.
Yeah.
The NFL is 14. The football championship subdivision, the lower half of Division 1, is 24.
Oh my
God. Division 2, I believe, is 28. The late Mike Leach, the coach of Texas Tech and then Washington State and Mississippi State, had a years-long penchant of proposing a 64 or it might have even been a 68-team playoff. There have been all kinds of ideas that have circulated over the internet and in the real halls of power for decades in the sport. I think there's no reason to believe that it will stop after going from 0 to 2 to 4 to 12. There will be a greater number and then probably a greater number after that. I think Ben raises a tremendous point about conference championship games. To a very real extent, conference championship games, which you should know are not part of the long-term history of the sport. They came about in the 1990s or later as a way to create more television inventory and to sort of settle standings that had never been settled quite that way before. They're not necessary to college football. The sport was doing fine before they were there. And competitively speaking, they have become farcical. I mean, if you look at the Big 12 championship game between Arizona State and Iowa State, yes, they've both earned their spots, but there were 9 teams within one game of each other in the Big 12 standings on Saturday morning. And the scenarios were roughly impossible to describe in such a way that they would fit onto even one piece of paper, let alone into one podcast. You don't need it for competitive integrity. And it would not be hard to just go back to occasionally having split conference championships, given that these teams now, the conferences are so big that a lot of them don't play each other. This was not a problem when the conferences were small enough that you had divisions where everyone would at least play their division, and then the 2 division champions would go on and meet in the championship game. At this point, they don't serve a great competitive purpose other than to allow a banner to be hung. And while I celebrate conference championships and conference play mattering, it could matter just as much without a championship game. I think the question as to whether they will ultimately done away with just depends on, particularly for the Big Ten and the SEC, the two most powerful players in the room, would the extra playoff games that would replace a conference championship game get more money for the richest conferences than their championship games on their own? Until that happens, I suspect they probably survive. And that's fine. I don't hate conference championship games by any stretch, but nor is that at all my favorite Saturday of the year. I take it below the 14 regular season Saturdays. Absolutely no question about it.
I think it's interesting in college basketball, you have in the lower ranked conferences, you do have, like, if you win your conference tournament, you're into the postseason. And I think that's controversial in some ways because it can one after a great season, one team can get off to a hot start in the conference tournament and then knock the obviously best team out of March Madness. But I just look at these conference championship games. And I wonder, like, if SMU, for example, so the ACC game is between SMU and Clemson, which it was a surprise that Clemson got in because Miami we talked about what Miami did already.
They backed it. Clemson gave up a 3rd and 16 touchdown to its rival South Carolina in the Palmetto Bowl to ostensibly tank its season, and then gets into the ACC championship game anyway because Miami, not to be outdone, loses at Syracuse.
They lost a 21-point lead anyways. So if Clemson now beats SMU, has SMU done enough to make it to the playoffs in general, or are they going to get this quote unquote punished for making it to the conference championship game and playing an extra game that other teams did not have to play and losing that game?
These are big questions. Also, specifically, could SMU drop below Miami, which has one more loss than SMU does and didn't make the ACC championship? I think probably not. I think that better sense would prevail and SMU would wind up ahead of Miami. But I think the fun of the next week in particular and of the selection process, which I would not generally call fun, is that there are a lot of scenarios that have just never been played out before because, well, in fact, every scenario has never been played out before because this is the first year that they're doing it. And so you go into this weekend and there are probably about 16 teams, let's say 15 teams that have quite a plausible shot at making it, and many of them are not playing this week. There are a handful who are out, but is it possible that you could get jumped in depending on what happens? That is fun to those of us who enjoy mess. And college football has always provided a good deal of mess. This is a new variety of mess that we have yet to see.
Yeah, I'm a pro regular season guy, which is sort of a losing battle. I'm over here just brandishing my supporter shield and my president's trophy while everyone is hanging the flags and the pennants and the banners. And I think playoffs have been prioritized more and more. And maybe that's a case of the audience driving interest, which leads to greater revenue and greater ratings. Or maybe it's a little bit of the other direction, just us being conditioned as spectators to prioritize the playoffs and all that matters is counting the rings, etc. But that's the way things are trending. And I guess what we've learned or relearned here is that people like sports. They want to watch as much sports as possible. I don't know if we can reach a point of sports oversaturation. And so more games, more playoff teams, more playoff games, the more the merrier, which I guess is good for sports podcasters and college football podcasters specifically. So good for you, Alex.
Hey, it's exactly what we want. Good for business.
Alex, final question. Do you think the playoffs and the heightened urgency have any impact on the fact that I got about a dozen ESPN alerts about brawls on the field after flag planting or trident planting? I know these are rivalry games, but this weekend was excessive with the after the whistle scrimmages, or am I wrong?
No, you weren't wrong. There were at least 4 of these that I can think of off of the top of my head after these games, at least little skirmishes, rising to the level of brawls with police officers for some reason pulling out mace. Was your pride bruised when NC State walked onto the field at Chapel Hill and began planting its flag? I forget if that was a physical flag or merely a metaphorical one after beating Mac Brown in his final game.
Because if UNC didn't want them to plant the flag, they should have won the game. Mm-hmm. I just don't understand how hard this is. It's a trident is, it's hysterical, but it's also a lot. But I can't get worked up over flag planting. And the pearl clutching has been really funny to listen to. Like, we need laws out, I don't know. It's a lot.
I think, to me, the answer is extremely clear. You do away with flag planting and you get into something much more exciting, which is flag burning.
Oh.
You don't even have to do that in the middle of the field. You can do that on your own sideline, get cameras around, make a human ring so that the other team can't get in there, and just burn that flag, Michigan. I mean, that's just get an Ohio State flag and just turn that thing to ash on the field at Ohio Stadium. I think certainly it was funny until the mace got involved.
Yeah, we're anti pepper spray students.
The funniest part of the Michigan-Ohio State brouhaha after the game was, to me, Fox Sports play-by-play man Gus Johnson saying there's no need to be disrespectful, talking about how Michigan was denigrating the game. What do you mean there's no need to be disrespectful? I don't know how many Michigan fans we have listening to the show. I'm guessing quite a few. But I think this was probably the greatest win in the history of Michigan's football program in one specific way, which is just in how much it wounded the people that they hate most in this sport because of what Ohio State is this year and what Michigan is this year. And so to say there's no need to be disrespectful is just a complete misread of the situation. There is every need to be disrespectful.
What is rivalry week for if not being disrespectful? That's the point of rival week. So I say protect court storming in college sports, protect flag planting, protect all manner of on-court and on-field shenanigans and hijinks.
Up next, running backs are, running it back. We will talk about it. Everyone loves a deal, but no one wants to jump through hoops just to save a few bucks. Turns out it really is easy to get wireless for $15 a month with the purchase of a 3-month Mint Mobile plan. Even Slate's president, Charlie Kammerer, is using Mint Mobile. And he thinks the Mint Mobile deal is amazing. He's on the $15 a month deal and is actually getting unlimited talk and text over their 5G network at literally a fraction of what he was paying with someone else. They let him use his existing phone and he didn't even have to change his number. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone with any plan and bring your phone number along with all your contacts. Right now, all 3-month plans are $15 a month, including the unlimited plan. To get started, go to mintmobile.com/hangup. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/hangup. That's mintmobile.com/hangup. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/hangup. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to just $15 a month. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. This holiday season, don't forget your number one fan, you. So what's a gift you could use? Maybe go to more home games, or even travel to some away games while rocking a new away team jersey. Well, here's something for you. Discover automatically doubles all the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. With Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. That'll help with the swanky away jersey. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. With my compatriots, Lindsay Gibbs and Ben Lindbergh, I'm Alex Kirshner, still with you here on Hang Up and Listen. The decline of the NFL running back is one of the most well-documented stories in sports, so I will not belabor it here. Only rarely do tailbacks go in the first round of the draft. Almost never do they cash in to any significant extent anymore in the free agent market, and they get the ball a little bit less than they used to, as the NFL has gradually shifted into a passing-centric league. But this year, we are returning to our national roots a bit. The first time was in the offseason. The New York Giants didn't want to give another big contract to Saquon Barkley, but their NFC East rivals, the Philadelphia Eagles, were tickled to do it. So they gave Saquon 3 years and $26 million guaranteed. It's a lot of guaranteed money for a running back in these days, and the way that he's playing, he's a bargain. Could probably earn close to about $38 million on this deal. The Baltimore Ravens sprang a bit less for Derrick Henry, the power back from the Tennessee Titans, going for 2 years and a $9 million guarantee. But both of these deals are working out splendidly for the teams. A week ago, Barkley set the Eagles' single-game rushing record on a Sunday Night Football romp over the Rams. 255 on the ground, over 300 in total yards from scrimmage. Fourth running back in the Super Bowl era to do that. Derrick Henry is having one of the best seasons of his career in Baltimore, next to the likely MVP Lamar Jackson. And on Sunday, the two went head-to-head, or their teams went head-to-head. Barkley got the better of this one, running for 107 yards and a score, as the Eagles won on the road. But both of these players are about 400 to 500 yards clear of anyone else in the NFL in rushing, and have a non-zero shot at 2,000-yard seasons, which don't come around much these days. It's also not just these two guys. NFL running games are bouncing back a bit this year after a very bleak 2023. Rushing yardage averages and totals are up per game, while passing efficiency has seemingly found a bit of a level after increasing for a while. So, Ben, we do have to ask the question, are running backs back, or do Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry just happen to be two very special late career running backs who are doing something very special at the same time?
Well, at least 2 running backs are back. This was the first season in which 2 players produced more than 1,300 rushing yards and 10 touchdown runs through week 12. So this is a historic duo here, but the ballyhooed running back battle on Sunday was a bit of a dud, with the exception of Saquon's 25-yard TD run in the fourth quarter. Credit to the Eagles defense for shutting down Henry. But Barkley, I believe, is still just barely on pace to surpass Eric Dickerson's single-season rushing record, which was set in a 16-game season, and maybe Barkley will slow down a little as the playoffs near, but he's already surpassed Christian McCaffrey's full-season total from last season, and Henry almost has. So we did do a segment about teams' passing problems after week 3 of this season, and part of that discussion was about the pendulum swinging a bit back toward running. So it makes sense that there's been a bit of a running back rebound. Teams have had defenders near the line of scrimmage less often. They're defending against deeper passing attempts with the 2 high safety setups and the hybrid linebackers. So you're getting fewer passing yards and more running yards, especially pre-contact running yards. That said, Barkley and Henry are roughly 500 yards ahead of Josh Jacobs, a fellow free agent signee, in third. So those 2 are basically lapping the league, and it's hard to extrapolate. What's fascinating to me is the way that these guys are seen and even see themselves as saviors of the position. It's as if every run is a bunch of small steps for 2 men and a giant leap for running back kind. And they have kind of expressed some solidarity, and they've commiserated about the plight of the position, and they've strategized together, and they celebrate each other's successes, at least when they aren't playing each other. Henry said, "We just want to go out there and do our job effectively and show that the position matters. Hopefully we've been doing that well enough to add value for the future of this position and the guys that are coming up and getting paid. It's a great time for us to be able to have success, and hopefully it bounces off to the other guys that are coming up and getting the opportunity to get paid." So that's fairly rare, I would say, across sports for players to see themselves not just as representatives of a team or even of the league or the sport, but of a specific position.
It definitely is. I think that what we've seen with NFL running backs the last few years is a position-centric, almost organizing movement that is definitely unheard of in any other sport. You know, that when you hear talks about things like a running backs union or about running backs having Zoom calls to figure out how they can possibly push back together as like almost a mini bargaining unit within the NFL Players Association. Lindsay, the question that I have is, will this feeling of running back empowerment, if you will, hold up when, for instance, it's the free agency class this upcoming spring, winter, and instead of Barkley and Henry, 2 Hall of Famers probably, or at least one in Henry's case, being on the market, you know, it's Najee Harris and Nick Chubb, who's been injured, and Aaron Jones headlining the free agent running back class. I think that's the big question, and it may be harder when there's not a Barkley or a Henry in the mix.
I agree completely, but I think it's good. Like, the decline of the running back has made me sad. Just anytime you say a position is done, like you're 25 and you're over the hill, like you get on your second contract and it's over. I don't like that type of talk. I love the hard-nosed football running back ethos, and I think it's important for the sport. I mean, I wonder a lot about the development of the position. We kind of glossed over that Georgia Tech 8 overtime game where, for some reason, college football now has like 2-point conversions on each side for an overtime, like a penalty shootout almost. But I remember being like, why aren't they running the ball ever? There were so many passes on that. And it made me wonder, and Alex, maybe you know more about this, if running backs are just not being developed really in college because it's like a circle, because the lack of value in the NFL, they've really gone down in draft stature, and then it just kind of almost phases out of the game completely.
I think that running backs are still developing in college because running backs are still absolutely crucial to college teams' offensive plans. Okay. I mean, the run rates are higher in college. The percentage of plays in college that at least involve a read to give the ball to a running back, whether the quarterback pulls it or not, is still really high. And so I think college teams have incentive to develop running backs. I do think that you're onto something, though. I think that as early as high school, I think that players, at least the best ones, have come to realize and to think a bit more about positional value in football and about how that might affect their careers. If you are a really talented 6 foot, 180 pound high school sophomore who could maybe play cornerback or could maybe play wide receiver, in general, you should do what you're better at, because if you're just trying to get a college scholarship, they're always going to need corners. They're always going to need wide receivers. But if you're a 4-star, a 5-star type of, heavily recruited young football prospect, you should probably play wide receiver, because wide receivers in the NFL are making way more money than cornerbacks at the top level. The best cornerbacks in the NFL are making the money of a pretty solid number one receiver who you feel good about on your team. But there's no Justin Jefferson contract being given out to the best corners in the NFL. I think for most young athletes to think about that would be foolhardy, because you're not going to get that far. But if you are a 4 or 5-star, who is still, by the way, a long shot to ever get to the NFL, you probably are thinking about that now in a way that you weren't before. And I think that extends to, do you want to play running back? Are you maybe of the size where you could make it work as a wide receiver because your body hasn't fully developed yet? You're not exactly sure what your frame's going to look like as you get older. There are certain players who are wisely thinking about that early on in their football lives.
Yeah, I'm sort of skeptical that this will lead to a league-wide change as opposed to a more targeted one, because it's not as if these guys are scrubs who came out of nowhere. Barkley and Henry and Jacobs all were franchise tagged in the past before becoming free agents, and so they are excelling. They're also maybe benefiting from better support. Barkley's getting much better blocking with the Eagles than he had previously, and so he's getting more yards before contact, and that's a big part of the difference. And there's still the realities of the position. Henry's not quite 31, and it's already being described as sort of the old guys still got it situation. That's just the reality for running backs, because they do take a lot of wear and tear. Now, I guess the benefit of that is that they're sort of meat shields for someone else who might be taking those hits. If you have, say, Lamar Jackson, and you have a breed of hybrid running quarterbacks who are going to take advantage of the new defenses to run more themselves, well, if they can hand off, then maybe they're getting a little less banged up, and maybe that helps you in the long run. But I just don't know, other than the outliers, whether there's going to be a big change to this long-term trend. There was that notorious Hard Knocks where the Giants GM told John Mara that they had to let Saquon go so they could devote more resources to protecting Daniel Jones. And Mara said he'd have a tough time sleeping if Barkley went to Philly. And Barkley did indeed go to the Giants' division rival, and the Giants have subsequently released Jones. So if this leads to a slightly less QB-centric mentality, maybe that would be the best for the sport. Maybe it leads to a little more variety, a little better balance between running and throwing. I was on Hang Up as a guest one time, maybe last year, and we talked about the parallels between running backs and starting pitchers in baseball, both of which have been somewhat devalued. And I made the point that even if individual starters have been devalued in baseball, you still need someone to throw as many innings as you used to, whereas you don't have to hand off the ball. You don't have to run it. You can throw. And so it's not as if you're getting just as much running yardage as you used to. But since things are swinging back in that direction, then you are going to get more carries and more touches. And I think it's good to have some star running backs. Even if they are outliers more so than they used to be, they're still really fun. It's still among the more fun spectacles in the sport to see Saquon literally hurdling over guys, making moves that you have to invent a new button in Madden to be able to do, basically. That's a highlight. That's why a lot of people got into becoming football fans. So to the extent that you can have at least some stars, even if they're rarer than they used to, I think that's a positive development.
I think it's also worth differentiating, to your point, between running backs being back and running being back. Mm-hmm. I think running is unquestionably on the way back, in large part because football is always a game of moves and counter moves. And it is very clear that defenses have geared for the pass. And so it will be met with a response of the run. I looked through last year some data from Optadata, a place where I've done some other freelance work along with my work at Slate. And in 2017, zone coverage was about 62% of defensive snaps. And by 2023, it had gradually inched up and it was about 72% of defensive snaps. Zone coverage, meaning in this case, and for the upshot of it, meaning that teams are putting more safeties on the field typically. And there's, different types of zone coverage. There's middle of the field open, middle of the field closed. There's different numbers of safeties, but teams are trying to make it harder to particularly hit you over the top and over the middle with pass plays. And they want to make the explosive pass game harder. So you are going to just see a bit more running, which is going to speed up games, which lowers scoring output because the clock keeps moving after every running play and doesn't stop like it does on an incomplete pass. Like, running is back. Are running backs back? I think we might just be looking at a really special season for Henry and Barkley.
But, going back to passing, it just makes sense to have good running backs. It helps the quarterback so much. I mean, not to, brag, but Bryce Young has been playing very, very well lately, and he got a rushing touchdown over the weekend. But this
is sad, Lindsay. I can't let you do this. I can't let you do this. Don't get hurt.
We lost in overtime to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. There's no pain doesn't exist anymore. Missed 2 field goals, and it was awful. But anyways, a big reason why the Panthers and Bryce Young are playing better is because we have a good running back in Chuba Hubbard. Also, one of the best running back names in the NFL, period. But he's 6 right now in the league, and there's a lot of consternation among the fan base that he's not being fed the ball even more to help the quarterback. And as the quarterbacks, more pressure gets put on them younger in their career, maybe it's oversimplification, but doesn't it just make sense to have some veteran running backs in there to really help diversify things and take some of the load off?
It certainly makes sense to have a running back who can pass protect in those situations as well, and who can be a useful out of the backfield receiving option. The running back ethos, like the big lumbering running back who was a sporting hero and is like the player you grew up with. Like, for me, it was Jerome Bettis. Maybe for you, it was, well, I'm not going to say O.J. Simpson. That would not be good. But
how old do you think I
am? For you, I meant the audience. I was just talking about the best, the most physically dominating running backs of the last.
My blood is literally starting to boil.
To be clear, the you was to our audience.
Plural.
Yes. It could have been any number of less problematic running backs, but there have been a lot of them who have been real heroes and are like your poster boy running backs that have come through the sport over many decades. It stinks that that's the position group that analytically has been marginalized in the sport because they are such an important part of the sport being entertaining. And to me, it's like if sabermetrics had determined that home runs were not valuable anymore, and there was just no room in the game for a guy who could hit 50 home runs in a year, but, he didn't get on base that much. Like, that would stink. And it's what's happened in football. And so we see fewer long-term contracts. We see a little bit less of an onus on, like, making franchise players out of that type of player. And that stinks. So I'm glad that the Barkley and Henry year is happening, because we're sort of getting a very brief revival of that type of running back, like the running back who is so central, especially in Barkley's case, to everything that the team does.
Agreed. We need the buses of the world. Like, we just need that needs to be a part of the ecosystem. But a depressing stat to kind of tie us up is that in 2024, no running backs were selected in the first round of the draft, which is the second time in 3 years. And it had only happened twice in the previous 40 years. 32 running backs were selected in the first round in the 1990s and another 32 in the first round of the 2000s. So it's not looking good.
It's not, but what is happening in Baltimore and Philadelphia this season is looking good. So enjoy it while it lasts.
Whether you're ordering wings for the game, whipping up a 7-layer dip, or ordering pizza, there's something about football that makes you want to eat. And this football season, Uber Eats has the best deals on game day food. No matter what you're craving, from 2-for-1 pizza to buy one, get one wings, Uber Eats will be dropping new deals each week, all season long. Uber Eats, official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now. Terms and conditions apply. See app for details.
Lindsay, we talked about how guaranteed money for running backs is on the wane in free agency and also, frankly, in the draft. If you're having fewer first-round picked running backs, you are seeing fewer large and largely guaranteed contracts to these players. However, there is some guaranteed money that I'd like to promote at the end of this week, and that is this week's Afterball. You have a little bit of a piece you'd like to tell us about some unfortunate news in college football. I want to give the floor to you for this week's Afterball.
Yeah, we talked about the fun of college football, and I think it's really important to balance that with the reality of what the sport can be. So a little bit of a trigger warning here. We will be talking about violent hits and brain injuries. Medrick Burnett Jr., a redshirt freshman linebacker at Alabama A&M, died last Wednesday evening at UAB Hospital 1 month after sustaining a head injury from a head-on-head collision during a rivalry game, the Magic City Classic, against Alabama State. The exact cause of death was not revealed, but his sister did share a few weeks ago on his GoFundMe that Burnett spent his 20th birthday, which was 1 day after the injury, in the ICU with severe brain bleeds and swelling of the brain. He had to have a tube to relieve the pressure, and after 2 days of severe pressure, the family opted for craniotomy in an attempt to save his life. The Lakewood, California native, who friends and family called Medi, played for Grambling State University in Louisiana before transferring to Alabama A&M. He had 3 solo tackles and 2 assists this season. His high school football coach, Derek Bettle, said on X that Burnett was an unbelievable young man with so much heart, passion, love, and talent. Burnett's story garnered a modicum of attention over the holiday weekend because of a mix-up by his school, Alabama A&M, which erroneously reported that he had died on Wednesday morning and then had to retract that statement before then he eventually died, and it was confirmed by the coroner on Wednesday night. But really, throughout rivalry weekend in college football, I didn't hear Medrick Burnett Jr.'s name mentioned. And perhaps that is to be expected. Alabama A&M is a small HBCU located about 2.5 hours north and, in college football terms, a lifetime away from their powerhouse, Alabama. And Burnett was, not a big name. But it really felt like this story should have gotten more attention. I think there's some racism against HBCUs and elitism mixed up in that. I think if Burnett had been a player for a bigger school like Alabama, this would have gotten more attention. But it was almost convenient for everyone that it happened at the Magic City Classic, which is, I should note, the largest HBCU football game in the country. But there's such a lack of media attention around HBCU football that it was easy for this to fall off the radar. After all, the playoffs are here. Part of the reason I think that this story fell off the radar is that talking about the death of Burnett means we really have to face the reality of the dangers of football. And nobody wants to do that, especially those who are profiting off of the game, such as the media partners. It's important to note that Burnett was not the only football player to die this season. In Connecticut, on the same day that Burnett passed away, 14-year-old Jackie Gale, a standout on the Bloomfield Junior Warhawk football team, collapsed during a practice and was unable to be revived. There were 7 football-related deaths in August alone. In late August, Caden Tellier, a 16-year-old high school quarterback in Selma, Alabama, died from a critical brain injury during a game. That same weekend in West Virginia, 13-year-old middle school footballer Cohen Craddock died in the hospital as a result of a head injury sustained during practice. Last year, there were 16 deaths among collegiate, high school, middle school, and youth league football players in the United States, according to the National Center for Catastrophic Sport Injury Research. 3 of those were caused by traumatic brain injuries during games. Those deaths, of course, count for a minuscule fraction of the football playing population, and football has made strides to get safer over the decades. But the deaths are still there, and there's still too many. I don't have answers beyond just abolishing football, which I admit I struggle with because I love the sport, and I believe that the sport does some good. But I also know that ignoring the deaths and not talking about Burnett and his story is not the right way to go about it. We have to hold these truths at the same time. We have to talk about these stories, and we have to kind of sit in the discomfort about the toll of America's pastime. I hope in the coming days that reporters in Alabama and elsewhere, college football reporters around the country, will step up and we can learn more about who Medrick Burnett Jr. was as a person, because there's really not much information out there about him. But I did want to end with what Alabama A&M Director of Athletics, Paul Bryant, said about him in their news release, that Medrick was more than an exceptional athlete. He was a remarkable young man whose positive energy, leadership, and compassion left an indelible mark on everyone who knew him.
Lindsay, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think you are exactly right about the extent to which it hasn't been talked about, and my proof of that is that I host a college football podcast. Hasn't come up on my show, I don't believe even crossed my radar until you brought it up in our preparation for the show. So I think you're exactly right, and I appreciate you putting it on the show this week.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode. We also have a bonus episode that is live right now about the public square where sports are hollered about on the internet. Is it shifting from X, the formerly known as Twitter platform, to Bluesky? Or is it not really? To hear that, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking try free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangoutplus to get access wherever you listen. The episode is available right now, and we will see you there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to follow the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. For Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs, I am Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelma Beatty, and thank you for listening.